The courtroom was a place of predictability, where cases were often brief and the decisions made seemed to fall in line with the expected rhythm of legal proceedings. Judge Henry Caldwell had seen it all: traffic violations, minor thefts, disputes over petty debts, and it all blended together into a seamless routine. His reputation for being a firm but fair judge had earned him respect in the community, though some occasionally whispered about his strict approach to sentencing. It was nothing personal, he assured himself, just part of maintaining order. That day, as the cases went on, his attention barely wavered from the bench. The docket moved smoothly, the gavel came down regularly, and the courtroom remained bustling with the usual low hum of legal proceedings. But when Angela Thompson's name was called, something about her presence unsettled him. She was tall, with a poised yet unassuming air, walking to the defendant's stand with a quiet confidence. There was no loud protest, no attempt to bargain for leniency, just a steady, unwavering gaze as she met the judge's eyes, her posture suggesting someone who was well accustomed to navigating the world with composure. Her clothes were simple yet elegant, a stark contrast to the flashy, often over-the-top appearances he was used to from others in her position. As Angela stood before him, Judge Caldwell noticed the faint traces of weariness in her expression. It wasn't a hardened or defiant look, but more the kind that spoke of a person who had been through a lot and yet remained unbroken. There was no sign of nervousness. She wasn't pleading her case with excessive words or exaggerated gestures, as many often did. In fact, she hardly seemed to care for the outcome. "Miss Thompson," Judge Caldwell began, his voice steady, but with a hint of impatience. He had been through a long list of cases already, and his mind was already planning the next steps. "You've been cited for a traffic violation. The charge is clear, so I'll go ahead and issue a fine. $250, payable within 30 days. Angela nodded without a word, accepting the fine as though it was just another piece of bureaucracy to deal with. Her eyes, however, never left his. They were calm, but they held something deeper, something the judge couldn't quite place. Was it resignation, or was it a quiet defiance? He handed down the verdict, and Angela turned to leave, her steps measured and deliberate. But as she walked out of the courtroom, Judge Caldwell felt an unfamiliar pang in his chest. There was something about her that felt important. She wasn't like the others, the usual faces that passed through his courtroom. But what was it about her that stuck with him? As he moved on to the next case, the feeling didn't dissipate. He found himself thinking about Angela, her calm presence lingering in his mind. He couldn't shake the thought that there was more to her than he had seen in that brief interaction. The next few days passed uneventfully for Judge Caldwell, or so it seemed on the surface. His schedule remained packed with hearings, rulings, and administrative work. His mind, however, kept drifting back to that brief interaction with Angela Thompson. He couldn't quite explain it. In a courtroom where he had met thousands of defendants over the years, it was rare for any one case to stick with him for longer than necessary. But Angela had lingered in his thoughts, her quiet strength, the way she accepted the fine without protest, the look in her eyes. He tried to focus on his work, pushing thoughts of the case aside. But then, one afternoon, an unexpected delivery arrived. A simple envelope, addressed to him in elegant, almost pristine handwriting. It wasn't the typical communication from the court or law enforcement, and it seemed odd that something would arrive at his chambers without prior notice. Curiosity piqued. Judge Caldwell tore open the envelope and pulled out the contents. Inside, there was a single brief note, printed on thick, professional-looking paper. "The woman you find, Angela Thompson, is the creator of the Federal Peacekeeping Initiative. Her work has made a significant impact on public safety, shaping national policy for peace." The note was signed only with a name he didn't recognize. Below the message was a media packet, a set of press releases, articles, and detailed profiles about Angela Thompson and the organization she had founded. Judge Caldwell's eyes widened as he flipped through the materials. The Federal Peacekeeping Initiative, it turned out, was no small project. It had been instrumental in reducing crime rates across multiple major cities, promoting community-based safety programs, and fostering better cooperation between citizens and law enforcement. Angela Thompson wasn't just any citizen. She had been at the forefront of a national movement, advocating for nonviolent conflict resolution and restorative justice. The initiative had brought together various sectors, government agencies, local communities, and nonprofit organizations, all working together to create safer environments, especially in marginalized areas. As he continued reading, Caldwell couldn't believe what he was seeing. Angela Thompson wasn't just an advocate. She was a catalyst for change, someone who had successfully shifted the dialogue around crime prevention and justice reform. The more he learned, the more his previous dismissal of her case seemed almost thoughtless. She wasn't just another traffic offender. She was a visionary. A wave of realization crashed over him. The woman he had found, without hesitation or question, had been reshaping the very systems he worked within. How had he missed all of this? Why hadn't he taken a moment to recognize who she was before issuing his ruling? His mind raced. What if this mistake, this small, seemingly inconsequential fine, had sent the wrong message? What if Angela's work, and by extension, the broader cause she represented, was undermined by a judge's indifference? Caldwell couldn't shake the feeling that he had failed her, failed to see her for what she truly was. He sat back in his chair, the weight of his oversight settling heavily on him. The more Judge Caldwell thought about Angela Thompson, the more the guilt gnawed at him. Her calm acceptance in the courtroom now seemed like a quiet defiance, a woman who had learned how to navigate systems of power without letting them define her. She had likely encountered countless judges, lawyers, and police officers who assumed her to be just another statistic, a nameless face passing through the cracks of an indifferent system. But she wasn't just another person. She was a force of change. Unable to quiet his racing thoughts, Caldwell decided to dig deeper into Angela's life and work. He couldn't let go of the nagging feeling that he had dismissed her too easily. That evening, after the courtroom was empty and the last of the cases had been processed, he found himself searching online. It didn't take long for him to uncover article after article about Angela's work with the Federal Peacekeeping Initiative, FBI. The FBI wasn't just a local program. It was a nationwide initiative that had garnered recognition from law enforcement agencies, policymakers, and even international peace organizations. Angela had founded the program a decade ago, after witnessing firsthand the effects of violence and division in her own community. The mission was clear: build bridges between law enforcement and marginalized communities, foster understanding, and create sustainable solutions to reduce violence. The initiative wasn't about punishment, it was about healing. Caldwell read about how the program had significantly lowered crime rates in cities like Chicago and Baltimore, how it had turned neighborhoods that were once considered high risk into spaces of dialogue, restoration, and mutual respect. What struck Caldwell most, though, was not just the initiative's success. It was Angela's personal story. Raised in a rough neighborhood, she had watched friends and family fall victim to a system that didn't seem interested in lifting them up. Her drive to create the FBI had come from a place of deep empathy, a desire to make sure others didn't have to suffer the same fates. She had turned her pain into action, and the result had been something revolutionary. Her background, Caldwell read, was a far cry from what he'd assumed. She wasn't someone who simply broke the rules or made mistakes. She was a woman who had worked tirelessly for years to make sure others didn't fall into the same traps. As he read through a profile on Angela's work in an influential national newspaper, Caldwell learned that the FBI had already been integrated into many state-level reform agendas, with Angela herself being consulted by top officials in Washington. She had even been invited to testify before congressional committees on justice reform. Angela wasn't just someone doing important work. She was at the heart of a national movement, influencing policy and changing lives. The realization left him breathless. The woman he had so casually found wasn't just an advocate. She was a leader, an innovator whose efforts were being felt on a national level. How had he overlooked this? How could he have been so quick to make a judgment without truly understanding the scope of her impact? Judge Caldwell couldn't sleep that night. The more he read about Angela Thompson, the more his own actions began to weigh heavily on him. How many times had he made snap judgments based on surface-level details? How often had he failed to see beyond the external circumstances of those standing before him in court? The pang of guilt he had initially felt when he first read about Angela's work had turned into something deeper, a realization that perhaps this wasn't just about one isolated mistake. Perhaps it was about a pattern of assumptions, an ingrained bias that influenced not only his decisions, but also the way he saw the world. For years, Caldwell had prided himself on being a fair judge, upholding the law without bias. He had always believed that his experience and education had made him objective. But now, looking back on that courtroom exchange, he couldn't deny that something had been missing in his perception of Angela. He had seen a black woman standing before him, accused of a small infraction, and without hesitation, he had dismissed her as just another defendant, a person whose life was easily reduced to a fine. He had never paused to wonder about her story or her significance. As a judge, he had often been told that impartiality was his duty. But impartiality wasn't just about treating everyone the same. It was about recognizing the deeper context of each case, understanding the complexities of the people who came before him. Angela Thompson wasn't just another defendant. She was a person with a powerful vision, someone who had not only succeeded against the odds, but had changed the course of many lives along the way. Caldwell had been blind to that reality. The more he thought about it, the more his discomfort grew. He had assumed that Angela's background, her race, her gender, her unassuming presence, meant she was just like anyone else caught in the bureaucratic machinery of the court system. He hadn't even considered the possibility that she might be someone doing extraordinary work, someone who deserved respect and recognition, not just a fine. Caldwell knew he had to confront his own biases, but where would he even begin? The truth was, his failure to recognize Angela's significance was not an isolated incident. It was a part of a larger problem, one that he had inadvertently contributed to. The justice system he was a part of often overlooked people like Angela, assuming that their voices weren't as important, that their contributions weren't as significant. How many other cases had he ruled on in the same way? Quickly, without considering the bigger picture. He leaned back in his chair, staring out the window into the dark night. He knew one thing for certain. He needed to make things right. This wasn't just about issuing an apology to Angela. It was about understanding how deeply his own biases had shaped the way he interacted with people. It was time to change, not just for Angela's sake, but for the sake of every person who had walked through his courtroom, unseen and unheard. And that would be just the beginning. Judge Caldwell spent the next few days wrestling with his thoughts. He couldn't focus on his usual tasks. His mind kept returning to Angela Thompson. What if his failure to recognize her significance had caused her harm? What if his quick decision to fine her had perpetuated the very systems of injustice that she was working to dismantle? The more he reflected, the more it became clear that the apology wasn't just a matter of etiquette. It was essential to acknowledging his role in a system that often overlooked individuals like Angela. But how could he approach her? Angela Thompson wasn't someone who had just walked into his courtroom. She was a leader, someone who had created a nationwide initiative, and Caldwell, despite his position of authority, wasn't sure what he could offer beyond an apology. Still, he knew he had to try. He couldn't allow the mistake to linger in silence, nor could he justify it with the excuse of "I was just doing my job." This wasn't just about legal protocol. It was about recognizing the humanity behind every case, and he had failed to do that with Angela. He took the first step by reaching out to Angela's office. His heart raced as he dialed the number, unsure of what her response would be. She had no reason to want to speak with him after how he had treated her in court. But after a brief exchange, Angela agreed to meet. Caldwell could feel his nerves tighten. He had no idea how this meeting would go. Would she accept his apology, or would she see it as another hollow gesture from someone who had failed her once before? The day of the meeting arrived. Caldwell arrived early, pacing in his office before heading to the small cafe where they had agreed to meet. He arrived at the table first, his hands clasped tightly in front of him, his mind racing. He couldn't stop thinking about what he would say. The words seemed insufficient. He had spent a lifetime in the legal world, navigating complex language and formalities, but here he was, unsure how to express something far more human. When Angela arrived, she was just as calm and composed as she had been in court. She didn't show any signs of hostility, but Caldwell could sense the walls she had built. She had no reason to trust him. Why should she? He had made his judgment without regard for her identity or the weight of her work. He had been quick to assume, quick to judge, and now, here she was, sitting across from him, waiting for him to prove that his words meant more than a mere apology. "Angela," he began, his voice steady but filled with a quiet sincerity. "I owe you an apology. When you were in my courtroom, I failed to see you for who you truly are. I made a decision quickly, without understanding the impact of your work or your importance, and for that, I am deeply sorry." He paused, watching her face for any sign of emotion. There was none. Not yet, anyway. "I was wrong, and I want to learn from this. I want to understand how I can do better, how I can be better, not just for you, but for everyone who stands in front of me." His voice grew firmer as he spoke, conviction building. "I can't change the past, but I can change how I move forward." Angela remained silent for a long moment, her gaze steady, yet unreadable. Then slowly she nodded. "I appreciate your honesty, Judge. It means something to me that you're willing to confront your actions. But understanding the weight of your apology is just the beginning. There's a lot more work to do, not just for you, but for all of us." Her words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. Caldwell wasn't sure where this conversation would go, but for the first time in a long while, he felt a sense of hope. There was a possibility here, a chance to make things right, to build something better. And maybe, just maybe, this was the first step in a larger journey of change. The conversation with Angela Thompson had lingered in Judge Caldwell's mind long after they parted ways. She hadn't offered an immediate forgiveness, but instead, she had left him with a challenge to do more than apologize, to truly understand the implications of his actions and their role in perpetuating systems of injustice. Caldwell couldn't shake the feeling that this was more than just an isolated case. Angela's message had struck a deep chord within him, and he knew that if he truly wanted to make amends, he needed to understand the broader context of the issues she was addressing. In the following weeks, Caldwell began meeting with experts on restorative justice, community policing, and social equity. He sat down with academics, activists, and even former law enforcement officers who had worked alongside Angela in her peacekeeping initiatives. He read books and attended workshops. He wasn't just learning about new ideas or policies. He was confronting the biases that had shaped his worldview for so long. Through these conversations, Caldwell discovered the extent of his own ignorance. He realized that he had grown accustomed to seeing people through a narrow lens, one defined by legal codes, societal expectations, and ingrained stereotypes. Angela's work was an effort to push beyond that lens, to create a new kind of justice system, one based on understanding, rehabilitation, and collaboration rather than punishment. Caldwell's days became filled with self-reflection. He thought about the faces that had passed through his courtroom over the years, the defendants who had looked like they were merely statistics in a broken system, the ones who had been dismissed too easily. He began to see the flaws in his approach, flaws that had contributed to a justice system that prioritized fines, sentences, and convictions over empathy, education, and second chances. One afternoon, Caldwell met Angela again, this time in her office, surrounded by maps and charts outlining the reach of the federal peacekeeping initiative. As she spoke about the initiative's success stories, Caldwell found himself listening with a new kind of attention, one that was no longer clouded by assumptions or biases. He asked more questions than he had ever asked before, curious about how Angela had navigated the complexities of community engagement, how she had built trust in communities that had historically been at odds with law enforcement. Angela spoke with passion about the need to rebuild relationships, to give people a chance to heal rather than simply punishing them for past mistakes. "You see, Judge," she said with a soft but firm tone, "we can't continue to approach justice with a mindset that says people are disposable. We have to ask why they're in the system in the first place. What led them here? How can we work together to fix it?" Caldwell felt the weight of her words. For years, he had viewed justice as a straightforward equation: law enforcement, a ruling, consequences. But Angela's vision challenged that thinking. Justice wasn't just about following the rules. It was about understanding the people who broke them, the circumstances that led them there, and the ways in which society could help them find a different path. As they spoke, Caldwell felt the walls he had built around his own understanding begin to crumble. Angela wasn't just a woman who had been caught in his courtroom. She was a guide to a better way. Caldwell knew that his work as a judge would never be the same. He had begun a journey that, while still new, felt full of promise. A journey that might help him see everyone in his courtroom for who they truly were, and not just for the label they carried. It was a small step, but it was a step toward justice in its most human form. Judge Caldwell was not someone who took change lightly. For years, his role as a judge had been defined by order, structure, and a clear sense of right and wrong. But the more he delved into the principles behind restorative justice and Angela Thompson's work, the more he realized that the rigid framework he had once relied on was insufficient. The systems he had helped enforce had often perpetuated the very injustices Angela was fighting to dismantle. To continue serving with the same mindset would be a disservice to the people who came before him in his courtroom. Caldwell began taking small steps to transform his approach. He started by adjusting the way he handled minor offenses, the same types of cases where he had made his mistake with Angela. Instead of immediately issuing fines or judgments, he began asking questions that allowed defendants to share their stories, their backgrounds, and their struggles. He wanted to know what had brought them to court, not just whether they had violated the law. For some, it was a lack of resources. For others, it was systemic inequalities that had followed them their whole lives. Each case now felt more like a conversation than a transaction. And with every conversation, Caldwell was learning something new, something human. At first, his fellow judges were skeptical. They questioned why he was spending so much time listening to the defendants, especially in cases that seemed cut and dry. Some even whispered that he was becoming too soft, that a judge's job wasn't to sympathize but to rule. But Caldwell wasn't swayed. He had seen the results of a system that only focused on punishment, and he was convinced there had to be another way, a more thoughtful, compassionate approach to justice. One day, Caldwell found himself sitting in his chambers, a pile of case files in front of him. It was the usual mix of traffic violations, petty thefts, and minor offenses. He was reviewing the case when his secretary knocked on the door, interrupting his thoughts. "Judge, there's a call for you." "It's Angela Thompson," she said with a hint of surprise. Caldwell picked up the phone, a feeling of anticipation rising in his chest. "Angela, it's good to hear from you." "Judge," Angela replied, her voice calm but with a sense of urgency, "I've been hearing a lot of good things about you. I think you're starting to get the right idea, but I want to ask if you're ready to take the next step." The weight of her words settled in. Angela wasn't one to offer praise lightly, and her call felt like a challenge. "I'm listening," Caldwell replied, his voice steady, though a knot tightened in his stomach. "I think it's time you consider taking what you've learned and applying it on a broader scale," she said. "I'm working on a pilot program in collaboration with local law enforcement, focusing on integrating restorative justice practices into the judicial system. I want you to be a part of it." Caldwell paused, processing the invitation. This was more than just adjusting his approach in the courtroom. It was an opportunity to actively contribute to the kind of justice system he had come to believe in, one that focused on rehabilitation, understanding, and transformation. "I'll do it," Caldwell said without hesitation. "Where do I start?" Angela smiled, and Caldwell could sense the approval in her tone. "We'll meet soon to discuss the details. This is just the beginning, Judge. There's a lot of work ahead, but I'm glad to have you on board." As he hung up the phone, Caldwell felt a new sense of purpose. He had already begun making changes within his own court, but now he was being invited to join a movement, a chance to be part of something bigger than himself. This wasn't just about him anymore. It was about transforming the justice system as a whole. And Caldwell was ready. In the weeks that followed, Judge Caldwell fully immersed himself in the pilot program Angela had invited him to join. It was one thing to be inspired by new ideas and to adjust his approach in his own courtroom, but this was different. This was a chance to build something that could reshape how justice was administered on a broader scale, a chance to directly impact the system that had shaped so much of his career. The program Angela was working on was designed to integrate restorative justice practices into both local law enforcement and the judicial system. It involved bringing together judges, police officers, social workers, and community leaders to address crime and conflict in a more holistic way. Rather than simply meting out punishment, the program emphasized repairing harm, rebuilding relationships, and finding solutions that supported both the offender and the community. The goal was to break the cycle of incarceration and recidivism by addressing the root causes of crime and providing meaningful pathways for individuals to heal. Caldwell found himself spending hours in workshops, learning alongside police officers, social workers, and other judges who shared the same commitment to reform. Angela was a constant presence throughout the process, leading discussions, facilitating training, and pushing everyone involved to rethink their assumptions about justice. One of the most impactful moments for Caldwell came during a community meeting. He and other members of the pilot program visited a neighborhood that had once been plagued by high crime rates. The streets were quieter now, but there was still tension in the air. Years of mistrust between the police and the community had left deep scars. Caldwell was introduced to a group of local residents who had taken part in Angela's initiative. They spoke openly about their experiences with the justice system, sharing stories of loved ones who had been incarcerated and of neighbors who had fallen victim to violence. But instead of pointing fingers, there was an overwhelming sense of solidarity. The residents didn't want vengeance. They wanted understanding and healing. They wanted justice that didn't just punish, but repaired. As Caldwell listened to these stories, he realized how much he had missed in his years as a judge. His courtroom had been a space for judgment, but it hadn't been a space for true connection. Now, as he sat among the very people he had once judged from a distance, he understood the real cost of the system he had been part of. The pilot program began to show early signs of success. Crime rates in the neighborhoods involved in the initiative dropped. Officers reported improved relationships with community members. More offenders were taking part in rehabilitation programs, and recidivism rates started to fall. Caldwell felt a deep sense of pride in the progress they were making, but he also knew that this was only the beginning. The work would take time, and it would require commitment from everyone: judges, law enforcement, and the communities themselves. As Angela had said, this wasn't just about one person or one initiative. It was about changing the very fabric of the justice system, about creating a new era, one where people were seen, heard, and given the opportunity to transform. When Caldwell returned to his courtroom, things felt different. The cases were still there, the legal complexities still present, but his perspective had shifted. Every defendant that stood before him now had a story, a history that went beyond their infraction. And Caldwell was no longer just a figure who handed down sentences. He was a part of a larger movement, a movement that was slowly but surely reshaping the system, one case at a time. As Angela had taught him, justice was not just about punishment. It was about understanding, healing, and the possibility of change. And Caldwell was committed to making that change, both for himself and for the countless others whose stories he would now take the time to truly understand.